Congress and then work internally to show how your ends, ways, and means are matching. And that has yet to be proven, certainly on Capitol Hill. There's not a sense that they understand how the QDRs actually drove anything or how the budgets they receive reflect in any way the strategy in the QDR. I would argue that that's been true within the building as well, but I think the more important point is one of the customers, one of the stakeholders for the QDR being Congress, clearly don't feel that they're being served. And also the legislative intent is never met, and there's no penalty. I think we were just hearing from Colonel Chamberlain some of the new requirements. The legislation is extremely proscribed. For instance, the QDR should be looking at the Coast Guard and how the Coast Guard has a role within the defense strategy. It's also supposed to look at, for instance, the Unified Command Plan and specify what UCP changes ought to come out of the QDR. These are things that are never done, and yet there's no penalty for them. So the legislative intent goes one way. Congress continues to add requirements. The department continues to ignore them, and yet the document lives on. I think I have more, but I will stop there. But why not abandon hope after all that? Well, first and probably most practically, Congress is not going to repeal the requirement. There will be a QDR requirement. Even though they tend to ignore it, the way it was described to me is it would take too much energy to actually bother to repeal it than to just leave it on the books. It is worth wondering, the tree falls in the forest question, if we never did a QDR within the department, would anyone in Congress care? And the possibility of that is no. It might be like the annual defense report required annually and not produced since 2004, and yet no one on the Hill seems to have noticed this, or at least they don't seem to mind it. So you could just let the QDR requirement go by the wayside, but I would argue that this next Secretary of Defense, it would behoove him or her to really think about the QDR as a tool on which they ought to be capitalizing. The QDR can be this mammoth, pitched battle effort between the services and the joint community. But the Secretary needs to sort of try to reshape it in a way that's helpful to him or her. And the way I sort of see that happening is the Secretary needs to get down to those set of discrete priorities, something we never do. Speaking as a former OSD person, something we never do well. Get down to 3 to 5 key priorities that Secretary wants to achieve in the first 4 years, maybe the only 4 years of the next administration. And think about how the QDR can be used to drive an annual budget process and then a quarterly review process that actually makes the department accountable for achieving those ends. And they can't be ends like transform the force and win the war on terror, which are examples of the last top 10 lists produced by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, which I think he stopped trying to produce in about 2005. They have to be discrete and achievable, and they have to be things that can be measured. And to do all that, the Secretary needs, and the Chairman need, much better joint analytic capabilities. They need to call on and expect much more from their staffs than they currently do, and they need a lot more money. They're very much at a disadvantage relative to the services in all of those areas. One place where we think something that can really help the Secretary is to go out on his or her own at the very beginning of the administration and ask for some competitive analyses from outside the department on big strategic issues. You're not looking for people on the outside to get down to the force structure level, but you probably are looking at maybe alternative worlds, alternative ways of thinking about strategy, thinking about the environment. Are we looking at a long war environment? Are we looking at a series of hybrid wars where we really have high-low mix issues? Do we have a near-peer competitor issue? And if so, how does that fit within the rest of the picture? Those are the kinds of things you could go outside. You could go to the war colleges and get competitive analyses from the war colleges. You could go to NDU. You could go to think tanks. There's lots of places out there that the Secretary could reach out to and get that kind of front-end analysis that begins a debate and actually kind of helps him break out of the box of the internal fights, gives him a little ammunition. Last thing I want to mention is the broader context, and I don't know if anyone's spoken about this today, but if not today, you've probably heard it a million times, so I apologize for repeating this, but defense has to be looked at within the broader context of national security. QDR as a standalone is not going to be as effective, certainly, as a QDR that it takes place within a broader national security review. And I think it's very important that the next president, from the National Security Council down, orchestrate a quadrennial or just a one-time national security review. And within that, then, the Secretary can see how defense is supposed to fit. We may actually get a sense of what civilian capabilities are likely to be, or at least be called upon, and that helps us size and shape our force in many areas, but particularly stability operations and homeland security issues. So I think it's very important that we not lose sight of the fact that the defense community really sits within, particularly today, a much broader and richer national security community.